We know him as the Snakeman of India. His career of many decades as a wildlife enthusiast and conservationist is truly inspiring. Romulus Whitaker joins Janaki Lenin and Stephen Alter to talk about his life and times and his book, Snakes, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. Don't miss this session.
Hi, my name is Janaki Lennon. I usually write about wild animals, occasionally about a husband who has now become the subject of an entire book. So I'm a little bit out of my usual arena. And I look forward to chatting with both Rom and Steve about how this book came about.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rom Whitaker. I'm the animal. I'm the guy whose story is coming forth today.
And greetings. I'm Steve Alter. I'm a writer and also write about many of the same things that Janaki and Ram focus on in their work. So it's a huge pleasure for me to be here talking with them and to talk about a book that I enjoyed enormously. Snakes, Drugs, and Rock and Roll was really a spectacular read. As I said to somebody, if a book has a blurb on the cover by Zeenat Aman and she said, "This is one wild ride," I'm hooked. I'm hooked. But the stuff inside the book was equally exciting, and I loved sort of getting a sense of your childhood, Rom, going from upstate New York to Bombay and then to Kodaikanal.
Thank you for that, Steve. I'm really glad to hear that you enjoyed it so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, there were so many different things that had resonance for me, and I think the interesting thing is that sense of being a sort of displaced white person in the middle of India at a time when India was defining itself soon after independence, and sort of finding your own place in a country that was finding its own place in the world. And that to me was one of the interesting elements of the book.
Yeah, I was interested from your perspective too, because I somehow I knew I was different, and I knew I was in a very I was in an isolated circumstance in the sense that, when I was running around on the beach in Juhu, all my little brown friends, yeah, they treated me like one of them. And I sort of sometimes, maybe when I looked at myself in the mirror and realized, hey, man, I'm not the same as them. But I don't know. I guess when you're a kid, it's easier to sort of meld in with the group, and they might have thought I was a real weirdo, but they accepted me, and it was just so much fun to be with them.
Yeah, I think that those moments that you describe of being on Juhu Beach and just sort of running loose. First of all, I can't imagine Juhu Beach or that neighborhood as wild and open as you describe it. I mean, having seen it only in the last 20 years or so,
Yeah.
It just was another landscape altogether.
Totally. Yeah.
The other moment that I thought was particularly compelling in the book was when you go back to the US, and there's a moment, I think you get off the plane in LaGuardia, and suddenly you look like everybody else, but you know you aren't.
Yeah, I felt lost. I really did. I was totally intimidated, and it took a while for me to get used to it.
Right,
It really did.
Right.
Did you ever get used to it, really?
I think I did because, well, you have to, basically, for one thing. And although almost the very first thing I did was to go out to start college, and that threw me into what I thought was sort of an elevated high school, which it really was. And I rebelled internally, and I didn't fit in at all because it was so-called rush week when you're supposed to join a fraternity and sort of get social and meet everybody. And I guess a sort of shy fellow, and I felt like the word intimidated keeps coming to mind. I didn't fit in, and maybe it was because of my upbringing in India or just my personality in general. But I wasn't a social being, and that was the time when you're supposed to be very social.
Well, and college was such a weird experience in the US anyway. I mean, I had exactly the same moment as you're describing, where I got taken to a fraternity house for what I thought was a free meal. And then they took me upstairs and they said, now we're going to rush you. And I'm like, whoa, what's going to happen here? And then so all the language, just words like being rushed didn't make any sense to me at all.
What was it? What does it mean?
Well, it means you are being chosen as somebody who can become a member of that fraternity. And so that you'll then live in that fraternity house and be one of the fraternity brothers. It's a weird institution, but I guess a lot of people enjoy it, but it certainly wasn't for me. And I don't think for you either, Rom.
Oh, wait. I escaped pretty fast. And yeah, I sort of immediately latched on to one or two guys who were very similar minded to me. And we sort of together looked for a place to live outside. This was Laramie, Wyoming, which was, in those days, really a little town. It was just a college town, and that was about it. And we managed to find a cheap house on the outskirts of town, very close to where a lot of Arapaho Indians lived, and it was a very interesting cultural thing. But the main thing was to escape from that social scene in college. So I did get along with a couple of guys who were kind of similar to me. But one of them in particular, Ken Persons, was a ranch boy. He was raised on a ranch way up in northern part of Wyoming, and he didn't fit in at all any more than I did. So I think we grew pretty well together. That was a good choice.
I'm curious, Janaki, how the process worked of writing this book, because and you don't have to tell any secrets in the process, but I know that if I sat down with my roommate and tried to write a book together, one of us would no longer be alive at the end of that process. So I'm just curious how it actually worked and how you negotiated the telling of the story.
Well, you touched upon it. It was very, there was no process really. So I had, Rom had, like, he would wake up, have an inspiration, and take a stab at some chapter of his choosing. So I had these random scraps of paper with, beginnings of something, the middles of something else. And it wasn't in any coherent form. So the entire school year, or school years, which is half the book now, was one chapter when I got it from Rom. And it didn't seem to go anywhere. It was just a narration of various anecdotes. I did this, I did that, and then that other thing happened. So it was a real struggle to see a narrative through all these anecdotes and trying to drill down to what is this anecdote really saying. And so it then just pulling everything apart and saying, okay, that's chapter 1, that's chapter 2. And then suddenly I had some 13, 14 chapters just of the school years. And then I was wondering, oh boy, we have the rest of his life to go. And how are we going to fit everything into one book? And I said, oh, this is probably going to be 3 books. So let's just bookend this with arriving in India the first time and arriving again after doing his college and all his various other careers or attempts at careers. So basically, Bombay book ends sort of roughly the first book. And it kind of took us a while to get used to the idea that there won't be just one book, that we can't just do one book and say that's it, that this is going to take some commitment of time and effort, and it's going to be this long drawn saga. So that's the long and the short of it. I'm not sure we've perfected a process to do the second book more efficiently. So we're still at the stage of finding files, old letters, figuring out what happened when. So we are still in the process of discovery, more or less.
But Ram, it sounds like Janaki put your life in order.
That's a good way of putting it. Absolutely.
But these must have been stories you told many times before.
That's very true. And I think that was one of the sort of instigations for doing it in book form, because, you know, a lot of friends over a beer, sitting around, chatting, having our fireside chats and so on. A lot of these stories would come up and people would keep saying, put it down. We want to hear it all. Put it down in a book. Yeah, but, you know, it takes a lot of discipline to sit down and do that, of course. And luckily, the young Janaki has a lot more discipline than I do about writing stuff down.
Actually, what happened was he ran out of people to narrate these stories to. So he had to find a new audience. I mean, all of us have heard these stories so many times, but I also think that's the reason why his memory is so sharp, because he keeps repeating these stories over and over again. So he remembers them.
But so you didn't, none of it was based on, you know, diaries or letters or you had photographs.
Photographs, of course. I mean, you know, they're incredible, and I'm just so lucky that my mother was such a great instigator of photography. She was a photographer herself. She was a professional, and she got me my first camera. She taught me all the darkroom secrets, and so I was into photography from way back. But in addition to that, she was a marvelous saver of you know, old sort of letters and school reports and, you know, weird stuff like that, which and she saved and gave them to me before she left us. And you know, just going through these are archival things, and they're just little bits and pieces, but a bit and a piece can sort of set you off into a tangent on the other story or the rest of the story that you might have just had a whisper of to begin with. So she was marvelous in that sense. And then I have cousins in the States whom I wrote to, and they saved letters for me. So some of my early experiences in India were actually written down on paper. They're really funny to read now, of course.
And also Ram's older sister was always on call. What was the name of that school? And she would tell us the name of the school.
Yeah.
That sort of, so we really lucked out in that sense.
Cool.
Yeah, it's funny though, sometimes when you're talking to siblings or parents, your memories are quite different from theirs. I've found that over the years and things. But was your sister corroborating things, or was she correcting you at points?
Both. Definitely both. Yeah, I would get things totally wrong sometimes. And she said, no, that was not at all how it went. And well, we had arguments over things, but inevitably she was right and I was wrong. I exaggerate stuff, and I think she said, no, wait a minute, it didn't happen that way at all. And so I agree. Okay, I agree.
I thought I was also really, I've never visited Koti, and I've always wanted to visit Koti, but it was fun to sort of get introduced to it through your stories of fishing on the lake, you know, going out into the Shola forests, and then the motorcycles, which of course you and I share a fascination for.
Absolutely.
But Do you go back to Cody much at all or not?
I haven't been for quite a long time, but it was interesting because on literally exactly 50 years after I graduated, they invited me to come and give the commencement speech. And you can imagine that I thought, wow, what a chance to tell it all. But obviously, I couldn't tell it all. I mean, there was too many sort of, stuff that you couldn't speak to these young graduates and stuff about. I did manage to get a few things in, and I could see people winking and smiling and sort of getting the innuendos between. But it was a very interesting experience because my class of, I think, 13 of us graduating from Cody School, and I was there speaking to the graduating class of 50 years later, which was 120 students in the senior year. And, Cody Canal School had really changed drastically.
I was curious to ask you, Steve, did you see similarities between your schooling and Woodstock and Cody? Both of them started off as missionary schools. So and they're both up in hilltops. So and American bastions. So did you see any similarities?
Oh yeah, very definitely. And I think we share a certain antipathy to the sort of pieties of the missionary community. I come out of a missionary community. My parents were missionaries, my grandparents were. You came at it from a very different angle, but I think we reacted to that evangelical conservative Christianity that we dealt with in both of the schools. I think we reacted in the same way. I don't think in your book it harmed you, but it certainly set you in opposition to a lot of that sort of pious biblical pumping that was going on. And I certainly, growing up at Woodstock, rebelled against that very soon on.
Yeah.
But you didn't really have an escape because your family were also missionaries. So you couldn't really escape. You had it from both the school and family.
Well, except that I was very fortunate. My parents were extremely liberal in their sort of interpretation of what they were supposed to be as missionaries. In fact, we used to tease them that they were the worst missionaries that ever walked the face of the earth because they didn't convert anybody.
Excellent.
And but I think that the tension, which I'm sure was there at Cody too, was between different denominations of Christianity. So you had the very conservative Baptists and Pentecostals and others who really had an extremely rigid theology and a sense of right and wrong. And fortunately, my parents were part of a denomination, the Presbyterian Church, which was very permissive in many ways. I mean, it had its faults, there's no doubt about it, but it was much less dogmatic in that way. But the school that really, I think, I mean, I'm glad it didn't scar you, but Lovedale sounded absolutely dreadful.
Let's not talk about that. It was a shock, and I'm sure my mother really regretted it when she found out about it. But we were told that this was, one of these up and coming schools that used to be a military school. Well, it didn't used to be, it was still a military school, very much so when I got there. Can you imagine, 9 and 10-year-old kids having to put on an entire uniform, complete with holstops and puttees and polished boots and going to school every day like that? I mean, give me a break. And not only that, you make your bed and don't put any snakes in your bed. Snakes they call, if you had any ripples underneath the bedspread, that was a snake. And you get, and your bare legs, because you wore these shorts, and those bare legs and a switch, a little cane, really hurt. And a little American kid, corporal punishment in schools in the States might have happened at some stage, but I'm sure they didn't happen. Well, certainly I had never experienced anything like that. So, man, it was a shocker. And woof, was I happy to get out of there.
Yeah, no, I love the description of, I think your grandfather, I guess, comes to give a talk there and whisks you away.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can imagine me crying. I mean, I don't physically remember or actually remember me, but I must have looked pretty dismal. And yeah, I was very lucky that he came at that point and saved me.
But I'm sure everybody wants to hear about the snakes. I mean, that's the main thing. And what's fascinating is your interest in snakes started in New York State when you were in the country, and your mother encouraged you to do to explore the natural world in that way. And then Cody, I guess Mumbai or Bombay, not so much at the initial outset until you had your python in the back room, but Cody was where it sort of started mostly, no?
Yeah. Janaki?
Didn't you get some snakes from the snake charmers to keep for a while before you
I did. Yeah. But as you said, both, and even Kodaikanal was okay, but it was way up in the hills, and there were very few species except for the shield-tailed snakes, an occasional pit viper, which was very exciting. And most exciting of all was my first Russell's viper, which was at Merrigen Lake. Nobody had a clue that Russell's vipers were found that high up in the hill. I mean, that's 7,000 feet up, 2,000 meters up. And no one, in fact, what little reading that I was able to do about snakes in India was some old stuff, a treatise on the snakes of India by Colonel Wall back in the early 1900s. Didn't mention anything like a Russell's viper way up in the hills. So that was very, very exciting, as you can imagine. But, and, having a python as a pet, it was very cool. And everyone considers it a pretty strange thing that it was even allowed. But I keep saying it wasn't allowed. I was keeping it secretly. But people are kind of so that's a bit hard to believe. I mean, this is a big snake and it's under your bed, for God's sake. Come on. They must have known about it.
No, they
must have. But I also sorry, Steve, can I just ask one question? So when Rom first starts before he goes to Cody for the first time, Rom's mom calls up the school to find out if there were any snakes, just to make sure her son won't get into trouble. So did she ever find out about the Russell's viper, Rom?
She did, but much, much later. I didn't confess anything like that because she would have immediately known. I mean, the reason that she was so, encouraging way back in northern New York State, she knew very well there were no venomous snakes in that part of New York State. Although there are rattlesnakes in some parts of New York State, but that area had only harmless snakes. She knew that, and she was quite happy and encouraging that I played with snakes when I was 4 and 5 years old. But yeah, a Russell's viper would have been a bit of a shock. So I think I kept that from her for a while, for sure.
But the python in your room, your classmates obviously knew about it. So it must have been a sort of not that well kept secret.
Yeah,
amongst the students there.
That's true. I think I was worried more about the house mother finding out. She was a wonderful lady, Mrs. Gibbs, and but I think she would have objected if she had found out. So I did try to keep it under, and I did manage to keep it under wraps as far as I can remember. Yeah.
Steve, you were also interested in snakes as a young boy. I read in your book, The Cobra's Gaze, in the first, I think, prologue. So how come you never got into them? Were your parents not so encouraging?
No, my parents didn't have much choice in the matter at that point. But yeah, we did a lot of hunting for snakes. I mean, we would go out and turn over rocks whenever we were out in the hills. We basically had garter snakes, rat snakes, and pit vipers. Pit vipers were the only sort of venomous snake that we came across in Missouri. And there were lots of adventures with them, a lot of foolish things that we did at that point. But I think as after leaving high school, it wasn't something I focused on, because I certainly wasn't able to study biology successfully, or as a student of science, I was terrible. So that door was closing behind me in that way. But since then, I've kept my interest in it, and I try not to turn over too many rocks, or if I turn them over, I put them back where they are. But yeah, there's a fascination for anything that moves. I think that's the. But Ram, you were hiding another python later on when you were coming back to Bombay. Weren't you carrying one in a trunk?
It was the same python, and I would have to, when I came back for vacation, which was quite a long time, the winter vacation, I'd bring it back to Bombay. And yeah, that exciting bit in the book is about when it escaped. And I had this thing, I had to go to all the residents in the other apartments of this building, which we lived in on Kambala Hill in Bombay, quite a ritzy part of the city, and knock on the door and look very sweet, I thought, and say, I've misplaced a pet who has escaped. And, I wouldn't admit that it was a snake. And have you seen anything unusual? And yeah, I got threatened by one guy who said he's calling the police, and others were very kind about it, said, no, we'll let you know if we see it. And luckily I did find the snake at the end of it, but well, I shouldn't, give away the secret, because people have to read the book and find out for themselves. But that was, yes, a very disconcerting time for me to lose a python in an apartment block in Bombay. Don't do that.
But your descriptions of Bombay, sort of going back a little bit, I mean, I found it fascinating the way in which you were sort of immediately taken into this new family, particularly with Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and of course her son who had married your mother, her son Rama, who had married your mother. And it must have been I mean, you had a close family in New York, or you had cousins and other people there, but suddenly you were with a whole another group of cousins and friends. Was it very different, or did it just sort of feel like you exchanged one family for the other there?
A bit of both, really. It was wonderful. They were just so warm and friendly, but they're, considered me as a little weirdo, I guess, and sort of, but treated me as one of the family. And I think, getting through the difficulties of eating hot food, for example, no, remove that chili, don't eat it, because it will burn your mouth. I mean, I had to be told everything. So yeah, I mean, I was learning from scratch, but it is a wonderful family, and I was just so lucky to have a loving family like that on arrival in India.
Yeah, but and then your brother, there's a moment, and I apologize if you don't want to talk about it, it's not something, but there was this, for me, one of the most I guess most poignant and sort of disturbing moments is when you and your sister go with your brother Neil, who is the son of Rama and your mother, and obviously has a darker complexion. And then you weren't allowed to take him into the Breach Candy Club to go swimming. And that moment really hit home.
Yeah, I still shudder with what's the word? Shame. I say, no, I mean, I should have stood up for it. And you see a sign, "No Indians allowed." Give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean, this is in India, Come on, you guys. How can you
But
do
it's the
this?
it's the 1950s, so it's
Yeah.
not, the colonial era is over. And
Yeah.
why was that still going on at the Breach Candy? Do you have any idea why that sign was still there?
I really don't know. There's no explanation for it in any way that I can find. But it's interesting because when I went to the States thereafter and traveling in the South and arriving in Mobile, Alabama, for example, on the ship and going to the restroom to go to the bathroom, there's a bathroom is signed for whites and for coloreds. And, I was probably taken back mentally back to that period I was really outraged when I was in America. Well, why wasn't I so outraged as a younger fellow back in India? It's still a quandary in my head. I mean, why didn't I just
I mean,
really
you were still so much younger. You were also sort of still trying to get used to this place that had, there were all sorts of different rules that people played by and all of that sort of thing. So I don't think it was necessary. I mean, I'm sure you think about it with a little bit of, catching your breath, but at the same time, I could understand where you were coming from completely in that, because it's like somebody else put that sign up. You didn't put it up.
Yeah, and it was so much fun swimming in those pools and eating that ice cream and
Isn't it the pool that is shaped like the map of India?
I think there is one there like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah.
I remember I only went there once when
Yeah.
I was a kid, and I still remember going in there, and this swimming pool sort of shaped like the map of India at the Breach Candy Club. I may be completely making that up, but
Yeah, I don't recall that.
yeah.
But Rom hasn't been forgiven yet. It comes up every time he meets his brother.
Oh, that's
So-
good. That's good. Brothers should hold something against you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I give it back to him in other ways, so it's okay. We get along really well. We always called him the black sheep of the family anyway.
And he's a rock star, and you have a lot of music in your book as you sort of got introduced to American rock and roll early on.
Yeah.
Do you and he like the same music, or do you sort of fight over, I'll stick with Roy Orbison and you can stick with Frank Zappa?
Yeah, no, we're probably quite tuned into the music together. And when he first started his rock band, this comes into our second volume, by the way. But when he started his rock band in Bombay, it was very much to do with the records which I had brought back from the United States. So acid rock, this sort of stuff was just coming in, and Jimi Hendrix was very big right at the beginning there. So yeah, we still groove on the same stuff. We're both stuck in the 60s though. We haven't gone beyond that. We're, all this new music just doesn't make it somehow.
Yeah, it was funny reading yours, because when I was in 6th grade, I'm a few years younger than you, and I still remember in 6th grade, Sgt. Pepper's album came out.
Yeah.
And we were just coming back to India, and I desperately wanted to bring that album back because I thought it would give me a lot of cachet with the girls at Woodstock. But you mentioned it also as a sort of a, one of those memorable albums that came out at a particular moment there.
Yeah, definitely.
In
Yeah.
what way?
Well, for one thing, I was with the young Irish lady. And interestingly, I don't think we wrote it in the book, but this girl was she was a meter maid back in Ireland, in Dublin. And so when one of the songs on Sgt. Pepper's is, of course, Lovely Rita, the meter maid. And so I was singing it to her. And yeah, there were a lot of connections. It was wonderful.
Yeah. You've got the playlist at the back. I mean, you can take the whatever it is. Now my
QR.
technology is going to, yes, the QR code,
Yeah.
and get the playlist from that, which I think was an interesting. This is the first time I've seen that in a book.
I wanted to do it Spotify, but then they said, no, you'd have to pay for it for the rest of, the
No,
duration
no,
of the book.
it would be considered a commercial thing because it's
Oh,
related
okay.
to book. It's not for commercial use.
Yeah, but wouldn't it have been wonderful? I could have
Yeah.
put a song in after the end of a paragraph saying, this is what I was listening to then when I was catching that rattlesnake or when I got bitten or whatever.
Right.
It would have been so cool.
Well, I suppose you can have your iPhone beside you and you can work it out, and then as you're reading you can click forward. And
I was hoping people might do that. I mean, yeah.
Well, it's not that different from your book, Steve, where you have a list of all the species that appear in your book, and it's pages long.
I know, but I was just showing off there. No, I
wouldn't put that past Rom.
yeah. No. I'm terrified that somebody who knows what they're talking about is going to look at that list and then I'm going to be in trouble. But I tried to check it as much as I could. But the main reason was that and I'm sure you're going to get into this with your second and third book, is if you start putting the Latin names in, the whole book becomes Latin.
Yeah.
And there's no way to sort of balance it out, particularly if you're using a lot of local names, whether it's from Hindi or regional languages, and
Right.
then the English common names. It just
Right.
becomes, particularly if you have a list of 3 or 4 species.
Yeah.
So that was really why I did that in my book, was to just have the species at the end, so you could say Russell's viper, and then you could go and find the Latin name at the end. But it's a problem, I think, with any kind of writing about natural history. And I'm sure, Janaki, you find this when you're writing, your columns and then the books that have come out of those columns, is this, how specific should I be? You don't want to be too general. I mean, you don't want to say a little blue bird and a big green tree, but you also don't want to be giving Latin names and all of that sort of stuff. And that balance, I think you must deal with that all the time.
Yeah, it's actually easy with birds. It's the snakes and creatures like that which don't even have a common name in English. And they're only ever known by their Latin names. That's when you start wondering how to deal with it.
You make them up.
Yeah, well, somebody made it up to begin with. That's what you have to understand.
That's true.
These things they weren't passed down through scripture at some point. And
well, some of them were, that we knew bird names that we've known all our lives. So we got these guys out there who insist on changing common names. I mean, come on, you guys. Let's stick to what we always had for the last 100 years, at least.
I'm with you on that. I mean, a black partridge is a black partridge. I'm sorry.
Damn right.
It's not a Franklin.
Right.
Yeah. But I was interested reading about someone like this guy, Pallas, who has the Pallas
cat,
fish eagle, and the Pallas cat, and any number of things. He never came to India. He was sitting in St. Petersburg with specimens that some Dutch guy had collected, and they were being delivered to him. And he gets his name put on, a dozen or so species. Oh, boy. And he was making it up as he went along. So I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with, if you don't know what it is, you just, at least as a marker, you can make it up. You can say it's, the Janaki bird, and then I can look it up and find out which Janaki bird it is.
Yeah, we confess we've done a bit of that. But
that was the snake book, the field guide, when we had to come up with common names for all these snakes. And then we had to do it again in Hindi for the Hindi edition.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And now with the next edition and the additional 100 species of snakes, we're going to have to come up with a whole bunch more names.
Yeah. But you know,
Hey,
it's
there's one thing I wanted to ask you, Steve. I
Yeah.
think we're going to run into this problem in the second volume. How do you write a memoir without hurting other people? You've written a memoir, and I noticed it was quite a few years ago, but how did you navigate that?
No, it's very tough, and I mean, I faced it just. I mean, I graduated from Woodstock about 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago this year, and we had a class book club, and someone suggested that my memoir, All the Way to Heaven, which describes our time in high school, be one of the books that would be discussed, and I immediately sort of tensed up at that one. And but then fortunately a couple of other classmates said, no, I don't think that'll be a good idea. And it's interesting because you want to be sensitive to other people's privacy, but you also want to be as honest as you can be. And that's a tough balance. There was one girlfriend that I changed her name. And years later we met. She was so upset. She said, "Why did you change my name?"
Oh my God.
Oh boy.
You know, so it works both ways.
Yeah.
You know, some people want you to be honest in that, but yeah, I mean the really bad stuff, I'm always tempted to just leave it out, unless it's vital to the story.
The stories. Yeah. Yeah, we're sort of stuck with the idea of keeping first names only, and so you can well, there were several of them.
We did that with the first book. I'm
You
not
weren't
sure.
you weren't the only Arvind in the room.
Yeah.
But I'm curious in terms of now you're obviously into the second volume and the third. Did it? I mean, you broke the first one at the return to Bombay, or close to that, and did the second one sort of suggest a neat place to stop or not?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Janaki, where is it going to stop?
Well, the second book starts with Rom trying to set up the Bombay Snake Park, which then becomes the Madras Snake Park when he moves to Madras, now Chennai. And it ends in 1985 when he loses the snake park. So that's only 12 years. So now in the third book, we have to cram some 30 years.
Well, and then there's the fourth volume, which is sort of over the horizon.
That's when I quit.
Yeah, well, I think, but it's funny sometimes when you don't. I don't know how you work, but do you do outlines and sort of sketch it all out, or do you just sort of let it flow and then figure out how you can organize it?
We have to do an outline because we need to pin down what happens when, to know the consequence. I mean, if you're saying something else 3 chapters later, it has to be consistent. So right now we are just putting everything down by the year. So at least we know when what happens. So then the narrative, when we start writing the narrative, we can then figure out what comes before what. We don't want to be caught in a situation where we start writing and we write about 5 years and then we realize something was supposed to have happened that we forgot to mention that was 3 chapters earlier. So then you need to go and put that in, and then it upsets the whole flow of the chapter. So it happened several times in the first volume. So I want to avoid doing that in the second. So we're just trying to lay it all down on the timeline, which will then free us to write the narrative without having to worry about what did we miss? Did we not introduce a character where they were supposed to have been introduced, for instance? And are we suddenly talking about someone whom readers won't have a clue who he is or she is? So it's to avoid problems like that. So we're basically now nailing down the timeline.
Yeah,
And
it's
obviously when you have, sorry, Ram, you go ahead.
no, it's a bit easier now in some ways because people are still alive who we can rely on to fill in gaps. So
Yeah. But you don't have to obviously stick to the timeline. It doesn't have to be from A to Z. You can jump around once you've got your timeline sorted out. Then you can juggle
Yeah.
this material in
Yeah.
that.
I think our biggest challenge is just the editing of it. It's and sticking to the stuff that we think people would like to hear about and read, because man, I mean, in anyone's life, there's a mass of stuff, and let's stick to the fun stories, the interesting, not necessarily the fun stories. They can even be evil stories, but at least good stories. So
They need to be meaningful.
okay, meaningful. That's a good word.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but one which I think you hinted at when we met before you had finished the book, and you were saying how everybody's going to react to the amount of hunting, shooting, fishing, stuffing that goes on in the book. And I have written a review of your book, and in that I did say this is not a book for the faint-hearted.
Well, good.
Because I mean, as you were exploring the natural world, you were collecting. You were collecting dead or alive. And I think one of the fascinating parts for me also was when you're in the US and you're desperate to come back to India and you need $500 to get passage home, and you're catching snakes at 10 cents a foot or whatever it was, and trying to get that $500 together. It was crazy. You were out there in Arizona trying to catch them, and then in Florida.
Yeah. How bad we were.
But you weren't, those you weren't killing and skinning. You were catching them for...
You were dooming them. They're going to the pet trade, and people don't know how to look after snakes. If I look back at it, yeah, it wasn't a good
Was
thing.
it a pet trade? I thought it was for the Staten Island Zoo.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, actually, the very expensive snakes were for that, but the ones that Steve was talking about, the 25 cents a foot ones and stuff like that, that was sheer gluttony, I could almost call it.
Yeah. Well, you had to get back to India some way or the other. That was your...
Okay. Yeah, I'll excuse myself for that.
But I think the way he and his colleagues rationalized that was by saying, well, we are not causing the problem. It's development that's ruining their habitat that's really messing up snake populations.
Yeah, always putting the blame on somebody else. Yeah.
Well, I think the other side of it, which I think is important for people to understand, and I hope they would take away from the book, is that we so often we sort of sentimentalize nature. I don't know if that's a word, sentimentalize, but anyway, the sort of looking at nature through rose-tinted glasses, whatever metaphor you want to use, and we don't realize often that there is conflict. There's a lot of other stuff going on beyond just simple appreciation of beautiful things. Science wouldn't have got where it has if there hadn't been a lot of shooting and stuffing at a certain point. So I think that it gives to my mind, a very realistic sense of what was going on during that period of time in the 60s in terms of people's notion of what conservation actually meant. Because our vision now is totally different. I mean, and I guess that's the question. You've seen it changed so much, Rom, over the years in terms of definitions of conservation.
Yeah, no, that's the defining moment was sort of when I was asked to come to Papua New Guinea and work on the crocodile project there. And here we're talking about sustainable use. We're talking about conservation in the real sense. These are local people who have no other livelihood but to catch crocodiles and sell their skins. But they have to kill this animal, these animals, which I love, actually. I love crocodiles. But the whole concept of sustainable use is really the way conservation should go. And this is the way we can save wildlife. But it's lost. And we're into the preservation sort of side of things, which we won't discuss at length.
But the venom collection is a good example of that
Yeah.
you did with the Arula people there in Tamil Nadu is a good example of a sustainable model that doesn't kill the snakes, or at least most of the snakes.
Right. No, that's very true. This was probably the one thing that I did do that I can really be proud of. Because, well, it's not only for the livelihood of the earlos, but it's the production of venom for antivenom, which is life-saving. And we've got a huge snakebite problem, and they've partly answered the problem by producing this venom. So yeah, I'm proud of that.
Anyway, take care. Wonderful to see you.
All
Nice
the
to-
best.
Bye.
Bye.